What if the question, did Jesus really exist, is, in practice, the wrong question? Because in the ancient world, almost nobody exists in the way the 21st century demands. No photos, no audio, no government ID, no modern journalism, no social media trail. And yet, people did exist, and they left footprints. Footprints in official letters, political histories, courtroom realities, satire, accusations, and most importantly, in public reactions that simply don't happen when the center of a movement is pure fiction. So the real issue is rarely, is there one single perfect proof? It's this: how many independent lines, especially unfriendly ones, point to the same conclusion? Here's a curious principle. When someone wants to destroy an idea, they try to deny it. When they can't deny it, they try to downgrade it. That's why one of the most compelling historical routes doesn't start with a devoted follower. It starts with critics, officials, and observers who had no interest in defending Christianity. A discrete verse that matches this public not hidden framing is Acts 26:26, which speaks of these things not being done in a corner. Not as an external Roman document, of course, but as a reminder that Christianity presented its claims as something openly known in its world. There's a major difference between an interested testimony and a reluctant mention. When Christians write about Jesus, it's fair to ask about religious motivation. But when hostile or indifferent writers describe Christ and Christians as a social fact, often with contempt, that's a different kind of signal. Those sources aren't saying believe, they're saying this is happening and it's causing friction. And in the Roman world, anything that causes friction tends to show up in administrative reports, political histories, legal actions, and public commentary. A verse that quietly resonates with the idea of reality speaking even through opposition is Luke 19:40, the imagery of stones crying out. Not as a historical citation, but as a theme. When something is real and disruptive, even unwilling voices end up echoing it. One major name often brought into this discussion is Tacitus, a Roman historian who, when describing Nero's actions, mentions Christus and connects him to execution under Pontius Pilate in the time of Tiberius. The importance here is twofold. This is not Christian propaganda, and it aligns with the core claim that Jesus was executed under Roman authority. Tacitus's hostility matters too. He isn't trying to help the faith, he's describing a group he sees as problematic. Notice what that does. Critics can debate miracles, theology, and meaning, but the basic "there was a Christus who was executed" becomes part of the background landscape. Myths don't normally get pinned to governors and timeframes like that, nor do they spark communities that become a problem for the state. A discrete verse that fits the repeated emphasis on crucifixion is 1 Corinthians 1:23, Christ crucified. Not as an external proof, but as a reminder that the cross wasn't a late decoration, it's early, central, and even offensive to many. Another layer in the script is the idea that disturbances in Rome were connected, directly or indirectly, to disputes around a name like Christus or Christ. Even when details are messy, what stands out is the climate, debate, confusion, and social tension tied to the Christ movement in the imperial capital. The point is not to force certainty out of every line, but to notice that the subject was already traveling fast and stirring conflict far from Judea. Here's the hook. Before the year 50, Jesus' name is already creating division thousands of kilometers away. How does a supposedly late invented legend trigger early, widespread unrest in real communities? A discrete verse that matches the division effect is Matthew 10:34, where Jesus' message is described as bringing division rather than social ease. Again, not as a Roman record, but as a thematic mirror of what the outside world noticed. Now it gets even more concrete, the Roman administrative angle. Pliny the Younger, governing in Bithynia, writes to Emperor Trajan asking how to deal with Christians, describing their gatherings and noting they sang hymns to Christ as to a god. That is not the language of distant myth. It's the language of an official trying to manage a growing social reality. Pliny isn't writing to inspire anyone. He's trying to contain a movement. And yet, his report inadvertently captures something crucial. Early Christians treated Christ with worship language, and they did it publicly enough to trigger legal concern. A discrete verse that fits this idea of Christ's honor is Philippians 2:10-11, which speaks of every knee bowing at the name of Jesus. Not because the verse proves Pliny, but because Pliny describes a reality that resonates with that internal Christian claim of devotion. Another section highlights Josephus, a Jewish historian who records political events in which James is identified in connection with Jesus, who is called Christ. The value of that kind of line is its plainness. It reads like identification, not like preaching. Jesus appears as a public reference, known enough that brother of Jesus functions as a clear label for the reader. That's often how history shows up, not always with dramatic speeches, but with casual mentions that assume the audience recognizes the names. A cold, administrative-style note can sometimes carry more weight than a passionate paragraph, precisely because it isn't trying to persuade. A discrete verse that fits the family and social network angle is Matthew 13:55, which mentions Jesus in ordinary human terms within a known social context. It's not archaeology, but it highlights how Jesus is framed as a real person with real social ties. The script also brings up the letter attributed to Mara bar Serapon, a Syrian writer referring to the wise king of the Jews who was unjustly killed, alongside examples like Socrates. Even without naming Jesus directly, the idea points to a remembered figure whose death and teachings continued to echo beyond the borders of Judea. This is what long history does. It spills into broader culture, moral reflection, and the language of wisdom and injustice. A discrete verse that fits the rejection turning into significance is Psalm 118:22, the stone the builders rejected. Not as a proof text, but as a thematic connection to the idea of a rejected figure becoming central. Few things reveal reality like mockery. The script mentions Lucian, a Greek satirist, ridiculing Christians for venerating a crucified figure. But that sarcasm becomes accidental confirmation. He mocks because the target exists, both the movement and its message about the crucifixion. Satire needs an audience that recognizes the subject. So if writers spend ink ridiculing Christians, it's because Christians were already visible, spreading, and annoyingly real. A discrete verse that fits this cross as scandal theme, again, is 1 Corinthians 1:23. Internally, it's called a stumbling block. Externally, it becomes a punchline. Either way, it sits at the center. The script references Celsus as a pagan critic who attacks Jesus' credibility, offering alternative explanations and framing him as a deceiver. What's striking is the psychological pattern. Instead of saying Jesus never existed, the critique tends to say he existed, but he was this. That shift matters because it suggests denying existence was less plausible than reinterpreting the story in a degrading way. When a phenomenon can't be denied, it must be explained. Celsus tries to explain it his way, and in doing so, he treats Jesus as a real figure with lasting impact that still demanded confrontation. A discrete verse that matches the contradicted sign idea is Luke 2:34, where Jesus is described as a sign that will be opposed. Again, not as external evidence, but as a thematic lens for why criticism was inevitable. The script also cites hostile references in later rabbinic tradition, depicting Jesus negatively and disputing interpretations of his works. The logic presented is that the debate often shifts from "did he exist" to "how do we explain what happened?", a move common in polemical environments. Even negative portrayals can still function as echoes that the figure was part of the contested historical memory. A discrete verse that fits the attributing works to evil accusation is Matthew 12:24, where opponents explain Jesus' actions through a hostile interpretation. It's not the same source, but it matches the recurring pattern, not denial, but reinterpretation. Up to this point, the focus is on external sources, but the script also makes an internal argument. The Gospels are filled with names, places, officials, cultural and legal details, less like vague legend, more like a story anchored in a recognizable world. The claim is that late myths tend to be generic, while narratives closer to context often contain a dense, everyday texture. That doesn't automatically settle every question, but it does raise a solid point. The text wants to be tested against a real setting, not floated in fantasy. And the script connects that to broader historical and archaeological consistency claims about the first century environment. A discrete verse that fits the "we saw, we heard" tone of testimony is 1 John 1:1, which uses sensory language, heard, seen, touched. Not as a museum artifact, but as a statement of intent. This is presented as a grounded experience. The script also highlights Paul's letters as early documents, in which he names specific individuals and describes his contact with leadership tied to the earliest community. The sociological point is simple: inventing a non-existent figure while interacting with people presented as direct witnesses creates obvious opportunities for immediate contradiction. Yet instead of collapsing, the movement spreads, often where opposition would be strongest. A discrete verse that matches the named witnesses motif is 1 Corinthians 5:5, which references appearances and recognizable figures in the early proclamation. Again, internal claim, not Roman paperwork, but consistent with the movement's public name-based memory. After stacking these layers, Roman historians, administrative correspondence, Jewish references, Greek satire, and pagan polemic, the question takes on a different shape. It's no longer simply, "Does the Bible say it?" It becomes, "Why did so many different corners of the ancient world, even hostile ones, treat Christ and Christians as a social fact? And why did Christianity spread so quickly in the very places where it could be challenged most easily if there was no historical core at all?" A discrete verse that fits the "cannot be stopped if true" idea is Acts 5:39, not as an external report, but as a thematic explanation the early community itself used to interpret unstoppable growth under pressure. Just comment with one word: Tacitus, Pliny, or Josephus. Which of these sources did you not know about? If a lot of people comment on the same one, I'll make a video just analyzing that source.